I want to start out by saying that despite what many people are led to believe, I am a fan of Star Ocean 2. I love that game and it was my favourite Star Ocean game of all time at one point. I adore it. But that doesn't mean that it's immune to criticism. That doesn't mean that Star Ocean 2 is a perfect game. Now, since this remake's come out, I've seen a lot of people gush about this game. I get it. People love Star Ocean. I love Star Ocean. We all love Star Ocean. At least two. Like, can't say the same about the rest, unfortunately, and that kind of brings my topic about Star Ocean 2 being problematic. Because here's the thing about Star Ocean 2, and I don't want to rain on people's parade because obviously I am a fan of this game. I love it for what it does, but I want to give it the criticism that nobody gives this game because this game seems to be immune to criticism. Well, it's not immune to criticism from me. As a person who loves Tri-Ace and loves Star Ocean, I have to be the guy to do this, especially given the fact that I'm a huge fan of Star Ocean 2. Now, the thing about Star Ocean 2 that people never bring up, and it's a huge problem with this game, it's the narrative. Now, I get it, this was released in the 90s, the late 90s, where isekai wasn't overdone like it is today, and yeah, the first part of this freaking game's story, the first half of this game story is just basically the entire cast getting sidetracked, and there's an entire anime. They made an entire anime out of this, Star Ocean EX, which is basically mostly just this whole concept of just you're in this isekai style storyline where you're constantly getting sidetracked by all of these distractions. That's the first disc of this game. I mean, you could argue the latter half of the first disc, the latter section, or latter fifth of this entire disc has a little bit more narrative meaning, but the rest of it's just filler and padding. You land on Alia, and you just basically, obviously, you're introduced to this new world, and it takes itself very slow. It takes a while to get going, I'll definitely say that. But once you get going, obviously, you'll start meeting people, and then you end up getting involved in all of these little subplots. And these subplots each have their own little side story, which kind of happens with each town, and you go to a new place, a new dungeon, a new town, and then something happens in this other town, and then you get caught up in this, and yeah, it kind of goes on and on and on until you reach near the end of this one where you go to the front lines, and that's kind of where the story really starts to pick up again, but by the time that it picks up, it's the end of Disc 1, and you're on Disc 2. Now, Disc 2 of Star Ocean 2 is interesting, don't get me wrong, but it's rushed. You get introduced to these new antagonists, and it's not really long before you end up defeating these antagonists before you even blink, because sure, you have this whole MacGuffin hunt for all of the four fields, but the actual finale is just basically just you going after all of these bad guys one by one and just beating them, and it just kind of feels like it kind of feels like these characters never really got enough build-up. I mean, it would have been more interesting if the subplots were built around each of these antagonists instead of just some random stuff that just occurs on Expel that has nothing to do with the overall story. That way, it would have made you more invested in the antagonists and made you want to beat them. What they should have done with Star Ocean 2's story is have the main antagonists play a huge role in the first disc, and essentially each and every one of those antagonists have a specific part to play in the subplots, instead of just being revealed right at the end of Disc 1 and then expecting you to figure out who they are, which, yes, they kind of do explain it, and there is some lore about it which you have to really read into to figure out, but even then, there's just not enough. I'm not invested in these guys, and I feel like that was the biggest mistake and the biggest, it was the biggest fuck up for Tri-Ace with this game's story, because they really had it with this game. They really had something interesting going on, but they just messed up on certain important aspects, which led the story to feel a bit messy. And I think that has a negative impact on the experience overall. It absolutely does. and I can't help but keep thinking what could have been, you know? I mean, obviously, I'm not going to say that the Star Ocean series has always had phenomenal villains. I mean, but it's not like Triace haven't made phenomenal villains before. I mean, you just need to look at Valkyrie Profile to see that they can make villains really well when they want to. But the thing about it is that Star Ocean 2 had something. It was going to do something really interesting, but the way they went about it, it didn't really work. Now, here's the thing about Star Ocean 2. It got a remake, Star Ocean The Second Story Arc. And the combat in the remake has received a few adjustments. There's like this whole break system where obviously like you can like daze them and then you can hit them more, and there's also like a dodge mechanic. But other than that, it's still very much the same combat system with a few minor adjustments and rebalances. And I think it's important to understand just how archaic that system was back in the day. And the thing is that all of these ideas may seem cool in concept, and yes, I get it. They're trying to make magic more viable, and in some ways it does. Like, magic is great at breaking enemies and, like, stuff like that. But the thing about it is that, and I think people need to remember, the original Star Ocean 2's combat, for the time, it was pretty decent. I mean, back then you didn't have many action RPGs with good combat. You've got to remember, this is the PS1, you know? Action RPGs on the PS1 were not really that great combat-wise. I mean, you had, obviously, I think you had games like Legend of Mana and stuff, and you had games like East didn't even get a freaking, like, 5th gen game at that point. You've got to remember that. So you had East 5 to compete with, and Tales of Eternia. So, yeah, those were like the games at the time, and I can't really say any of those games' combat systems were like phenomenal. It wasn't until 6th gen where they actually managed to figure out a way to make it work. But Star Ocean 2's combat, despite that era, was good for the time. But if you go back to that game today, you'll start to see just how rough it is. Now, obviously, with the remake, you have these improvements that they made to it, which I get that that's a thing, and I'm going to bear that in mind because it does make some improvements. But look at the foundation we have here. This is Star Ocean 2. This is a game that originally started as a game where you basically just tank hits, and now you've got a game where you have like this evasion system, which is just kind of like a backpedal and like sort of like a blind side in a way. But yeah, like that's kind of what they've done. I mean, it's interesting, but it's not really going to work for everything, is it? Like, it's not going to work for all of those AoE spells that a lot of the enemies love to do in that game. I mean, that's pretty much the biggest threat in Star Ocean 2, really. It is those AoE spells. It always has been. And that's where the difficult aspect comes in. Whereas physicals aren't really the biggest threat, and it's always been the case. Like, physicals, like, you're supposed to, by a certain point of the game, figure out a way to bypass, like, physical hits. I mean, for example, if you do the survival tournament in Fun City with Diaz, you can just basically stand in the corner and just spam air slash and beat every fight up until you get to the final fight where they'll use Meteor Storm, which will just basically just murder Diaz in one hit, like just immediately, because you don't have good enough gear to protect yourself from Meteor Storm. But, as I say, you'll just beat the rest of them easily. Just simply because they're not going to cast spells on you, you're going to constantly stagger them, and they're not going to get to you. That's kind of how the combat worked. And even when you're fighting the last boss, the reason why the last boss is so difficult in Star Ocean 2 is because of his movement speed. His movement speed is insane. Like, if you let him go for 1 second, he can get to the other side of the screen, and it's very hard to just pin him down and stagger lock him. But there are ways, and that's how you beat him. It's a messy game. I think that's the best thing to describe Star Ocean 2. At least the original. The original Star Ocean: The Second Story is a mess, but it's a product of its time. And people need to recognize that fact. People need to understand, yes, it's acceptable for the time, just not now. And that's okay. I don't really have too many issues with the combat of Star Ocean 2. I just have to bring up that it is archaic, and with the improvements of the remake, even though the remake does make improvements, it doesn't elevate it to the same level that Star Ocean: The Divine Force has with its combat, which is a lot more involving and has a lot more going on with it. But I don't think most people play this series for the combat. People play Star Ocean 2 for one thing and one thing only, and that is the subsystems. That's the main appeal of Star Ocean 2. That's why we're all here. That's why we all play it. We play Star Ocean 2 for the Star Ocean experience because it nails the Star Ocean experience better than any other Star Ocean game. And that's why people love this game. They don't love it because of the story. They don't love it because of the gameplay. The combat at least. They love it for the item creation, the private actions, and just about everything that makes this game Star Ocean. And this game does a phenomenal job at having like a really fantastic skill system, really great item creation, and like fun private actions that you can do. And it has tons of endings as well, so you've got lots of replay value. It's a huge game with a lot of attention to detail, and that's kind of what you expect from Tri-Ace overall. Attention to detail is literally what they do best, and that's what makes their game stand out from the rest. That's my acknowledgement of what this game does right. That's what keeps me coming back. That's the reason why I play this game, and that's the reason why it's so addictive. But the thing about it is that it isn't perfect. And people need to understand that it does have its issues. Even with the remake, you can't deny the fact that the story is flawed. Is it as insufferable as other stories in other JRPGs? Maybe not, but it's still not a flawless story. It still isn't, and people need to be aware of that. I mean, honestly, Star Ocean 2, I can see why people would say that it's just another JRPG on the PlayStation 1. I can totally see that, but that's not me. To me, it's something special, and it always has been something special, but at the same time, I feel that because it's gotten so much like attention recently, and people are just raving on about how amazing the game is, I feel that I really need to bring some criticism towards it, because I just want people to remember that this game is not perfect, and that honestly, I feel that there are other games in the series that do better than Star Ocean 2 in certain ways. But the problem is that people demonize those games. And that's where I have an issue. I don't really have an issue with Star Ocean 2 at all. If anything, I just have an issue with the fan base that just craps on everything that isn't 2. I mean, I get it with 3. I mean, 3 has its issues, but there's one thing that 3 does really well, and that's it's got an amazing soundtrack. But the thing about 3 is that there's people who hate it for the combat, which, well, I understand that. It's a bit of a mess, let's be honest. And there's people who hate it for the story. And for those people who hate it for the story, well, I do kind of get it, but I disagree with them. I love the story of Star Ocean 3 because of how it dares to do something that essentially risks upsetting people, and I appreciate that fact. But I do kind of understand the criticisms to some degree. It's not a perfect story by any stretch, but I enjoyed what it set out to do, and I still think that ultimately it's an enjoyable story overall, despite its flaws. Now, am I going to say that Star Ocean 3 is perfect? No, it has its problems. Oh, it does. It has a lot of problems. The Star Ocean series is such an interesting series for me to dissect. Like, I've done an entire article on my blog just covering this game, and it's insane just how much I can criticize this series. I can criticize this series to death, but the fact of the matter is, I love this series to death. And it's because I love this series to death that I criticize it. I mean, Star Ocean 5, I recognize the issues with that game, but I love the game. You know? Obviously, I think anyone can figure out the issues with that game. Like, it's clearly low budget. It clearly couldn't, like, fully flesh out everything. And people just felt like they weren't getting a complete Star Ocean experience from that game. But I'd argue the same about Star Ocean 3 because Star Ocean 3 decided that it was going to be the black sheep by changing the experience to be less Star Ocean-y. And in a way, it's kind of funny, but I actually consider Tales of Symphonia to be the real Star Ocean 3 because it feels more of a Star Ocean game than Star Ocean 3 does. And that's kind of the thing. So, from a Star Ocean experience perspective, I think 3 is the black sheep. But many people think 5 is the black sheep, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that they were sold something that was half baked. It wasn't really a complete experience. It was more of, I would say, a demo of what was to come. That's what Star Ocean 5 was. And if you looked at it from that perspective and you knew that going in, you weren't going to really be disappointed with Star Ocean 5. In fact, you were going to be pleasantly surprised. And that's kind of what I was like when I went into it. I knew it was going to be a glorified demo for what Tri-Ace were going to do with the later games in the franchise. So I went into it expecting the worst. And what I got was a pleasant experience. Sometimes expectations are everything. And I feel that that's why I enjoy Star Ocean 5 as much as I do. But a lot of people hate it because they expected another Star Ocean 3 and what they got was disappointment. Because obviously this is a franchise that has been dormant for ages and the producer didn't want to take a huge risk and I don't think he wanted to lose his job, so he was basically just playing it safe. And yeah, unfortunately the game suffered from that, but one thing I have to give credit for, and this is one thing that you never see people bring this up, Star Ocean 5's developers deserve a fucking medal for making that game turn out the way it did, despite everything, because that game could have been far worse. Oh, it could have been, but the fact that they managed to incorporate so many things that were really interesting into Star Ocean 5, like the roll system and the item synthesis, is pretty amazing, and you can clearly see that they worked tirelessly on this game. They really did work tirelessly on it. So, it's definitely something that people need to bear in mind. But anyways, as I say, I just wanted to bring this up because I feel that Star Ocean The Second Story doesn't get enough criticism. I feel that more people need to be critical of it, but at the same time, people need to be open-minded and feel that they can still play a game and they can still love a game whilst also being critical of it and bringing up its flaws, instead of just singing its praises all the time. Because it's popular now, people. Everyone's singing its praises, but I've barely ever heard anyone bring up any criticism towards the game. And for the longest time, it wasn't necessary because the game wasn't super popular. Now that it's popular, it is necessary to be critical because ultimately, there's going to be different people going into this franchise, and we don't want to set their expectations too high. We want to make sure that these people go in with realistic expectations and know what they're getting out of it. That way, when they play it, they'll enjoy it more or have a much bigger chance of enjoying it, and that's what you'll want. Whereas if you warn them of things, they might be wary of it, but they'll expect it. They might go in anyway and love it for what it is and not be disappointed, or they just won't play it and play something that they enjoy instead. It's up to them, but we've got to be critical. We've got to be critical so that we can essentially make sure that everybody knows what's up with this series, because it's essential, and people need to be open to the fact that we need to stop crapping on the rest of the series too much, because I feel that we need to spread some love equally to the rest of the series, but still remembering why we have issues with them. Because obviously, Star Ocean 3, Star Ocean 4, Star Ocean 5, Star Ocean 6, all of them, they all have their problems. They do. But we need to remember them, and we need to make sure people recognize their issues, but we also need to celebrate them if we consider ourselves fans of the series. And I do the same thing with Star Ocean 3. I love that game. I do. I feel that game has so much potential to be better than it actually is. And I feel that Star Ocean 6 has taught me just how much I love that game. Mainly because, as I say, Star Ocean 6 has taken the series to such a high point that it's made me reflect on all the previous games in the series and made me think, why did we love this franchise to begin with? And then I looked at them and I remembered, you know? And I feel that Star Ocean 6 was kind of necessary in making me want to do that. And I feel that Star Ocean Until the End of Time has a following and has a huge fan base for a reason. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that its narrative was interesting and it was a talking point. But it was like Marmite, you either love it or you hate it, and some people didn't like it. But those who love it really love it. It's one of those cases where you have fans that are huge fans of Star Ocean 3, and then you have people that despise it. There's no middle ground. But I want to be the middle ground. I want to be the middle ground and say that Star Ocean 3 isn't really a bad game, but it's not a perfect game and it has a lot of issues. And I want to say that I am a fan of Star Ocean 3, and that's why I hate it with a passion. Because I'm a fan of that game. Because I see what it could be, and because I see what I want it to be, but it isn't. Am I pissed off that Square Enix decided to play it safe and remake Star Ocean 2? A little. Not because I don't like Star Ocean 2, not because, I don't really care about the Star Ocean 2 remake, no. Because they spent all of this effort working on a game that didn't really need a remake. And this should tell you a lot. Because as critical as I am of Star Ocean 2, I say that it doesn't need a remake. Because no matter what, the people who like Star Ocean 2 will continue liking Star Ocean 2. The people who aren't into what Star Ocean 2 did will never be into Star Ocean 2. Star Ocean 2 caters to a specific type of player. And that specific type of player is me and many other people. Those people that call themselves Star Ocean 2 fans. By changing the combat system and by messing with each and everything that I was critical of, you've essentially accomplished nothing. Some games do not need a remake, and Star Ocean 2 was one of them for that reason. It was what it was, and you had to love it for what it was. And that's how it is. Whereas Star Ocean Until the End of Time does need a remake, because that game needed something to fix its problems, because there's so many things that game does that look like they could be something truly amazing, but they aren't because of problems. Whereas Star Ocean 2, what it tried to do that was particularly noteworthy, they managed to accomplish, which was the item creation and all the subsystems. The combat system of Star Ocean 2 wasn't really problematic to begin with. It's just old and dated. And I guess that's why they remade the game, because it's an easy job. Just modernize it. But is it really that simple to just modernize? Does that fix problems? I would argue no. I'd still say that it is not too different from what it was originally. But that's just me. Ultimately, yeah, you can give it a new coat of paint, but it's still ultimately the same experience, and people are either going to love it or hate it regardless. So what's the point? Whereas with Star Ocean 3, a game that I have a love-hate relationship with, and this is the thing, do people have a love-hate relationship with 2? I mean, maybe there are, and for those people, maybe the remake worked for them, I don't know, but for me, I love that game. I'm critical of it, but I love that game. Star Ocean 3, I have a love-hate relationship with it. I have a lot of issues with that game, a lot of problems with that game, but I also love it so much that I want to see a remake, because I want to see it be the game that I want it to be, whereas Star Ocean 2 is the game that I want it to be on PS1, I didn't want it to be anything more, I didn't expect it to be anything more. All the remake of Star Ocean 2 has done is show just how old that game is, and just how archaic that game is. It's kind of like when you bring back old wrestlers like Goldberg and just basically have them wrestle these matches that they are just not prepared for, and it just shows just how old and worn out they are, that's kind of what that remake did to Star Ocean 2. It exposed it for what it is. It's a dated, worn out game that is old. And we don't want games to be like that. We don't want to treat games like that. We want to celebrate games for what they were, not expose them for what they are now. But at the same time, it is important for people to be aware that these games are old and they have dated aspects, and that's important. That is important. And that's the job for game reviewers. But remakes like this, all they do is expose these things, especially when they're done in the way that they are, because it just exposes just how old they are, and all the mechanics have done is just essentially make the game look like it's been patched up, and that's basically it. Like, it doesn't feel like something new or fresh. It doesn't feel like something that's trying to do something incredible or trying to make something incredible work. It's trying to basically just do the bare minimum to modernize a video game, and that's something that I'm against. I don't think we should be doing that. What I think we should be doing instead is fixing games that have problems, big problems, that can bring great results. I'm looking at games like Odin Sphere Leifrisia, for example. That's a game that absolutely nailed it. That game absolutely nailed it and did everything that I wanted it to do, and they accomplished it. So I say do the same thing with Star Ocean 3. But here's the thing, and this is the problem, the biggest issue, and it's the fact that Star Ocean 2 Remake wasn't even made by Tri-Ace, which should tell you everything. Are Square Enix going to get some random company to fix Star Ocean 3? No, because they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. Only Tri-Ace could do that, because only Tri-Ace knows how they made Star Ocean 3, and only Tri-Ace would know how to fix it. That's the thing. That's the underlying issue, and this is my biggest problem with Square Enix right now. The fact that they are basically just leaving Tri-Ace in the dust as much as they can, and like giving their other IPs to other game developers and just outsourcing development to these other game companies. And I'm 100% against that. I mean, I'm not saying that Tri-Ace will be. I'm sure Tri-Ace are going to be fine regardless, but personally, I am, because that's insulting my intelligence as a fan, because I am aware of who brought these things into being in the first place, and if anyone's going to touch these games, it's Tri-Ace, because it's theirs, and only they know best. It's a matter of principle. I don't think that you should just give away a game franchise to another company unless the company that's making it just can't hack it anymore. In the sense that, like, for example, Game Freak with Pokemon, they can't hack it anymore. Give it to Genius Sonority, they can do it. It was getting old. It was getting old, guys. Give it to someone else. But the thing is, Tri-Ace are not that company. It's not getting old with Tri-Ace. Tri-Ace are phenomenal. They are amazing. They make the colossal fuck-ups, absolute colossal fuck-ups. Oh my god, like, I can't stress it enough how much they colossally fuck up. But do you know why they fuck up so much? Do you know why Tri-Ace games are so rough and they screw up so many times? I'll tell you why. It's because those developers take risks. Those developers actually dare to do what no one in this industry does, and that is actually risk it all and risk ruining a game to try and achieve something truly fantastic. Because these people still have passion, and that's why I always support Tri-Ace, because these are developers that love video games. And will I call them out on their issues? Absolutely. But despite all of that, I still love what that company does, because they still stick by the principle of take risks and, take chances. Instead of playing it safe, this company actually dares to go against the norms, which you see so many times in gaming nowadays. You see all of this shit where they all try to like tick the boxes and check off all the check marks to make sure that it passes, like all the necessary bullshit, so that it's ready for release. Tri-Ace doesn't do that. Tri-Ace does it Tri-Ace's way, and that's why Tri-Ace gets a lot of hate. But then you get a game released by Gemdrops, a company that does all the box checking, and it gets celebrated. And it's probably the most celebrated Star Ocean game yet. And that pisses me off, because that just shows just what the Star Ocean fan base is like. They are just drones who will just celebrate any company that operates the way that these big AAA publishers want them to operate, by ticking all the boxes instead of actually making games that they want to make. And I am against that. I want game developers to take chances. You might not like games that take chances. I don't like Miyazaki's games. I don't like Dark Souls, but at the end of the day, am I going to demonize its very existence? No, I've got better things to do. Other people will, I just won't play it. I just don't care about Dark Souls or Soulsborne. That's basically it. You won't see me ever play them. But do I think that they should stop making them? Well, I don't care less, to be honest. You know? But when I hear people say stuff like, oh yeah, they should totally have gem drops just replace Tri-Ace for the game development. And I've heard this. I've heard people just say, oh yeah, gem drops made such an amazing game with Star Ocean 2 Remake. They should just make the next Star Ocean game. I'm just like, what? Sorry, what? And this is the problem. This is the problem. It's not the game developers, it's not the games, it's the fan base. And I figured it out. I figured it all out. The biggest problem with Star Ocean and Star Ocean 2 and the Star Ocean series is the fans. It always has been. That's why Star Ocean 5 ended up the way it was. Because Star Ocean 5, they tried to basically pander to Star Ocean 3 fans because they were the most vocal, and to do that they had to fix Star Ocean 3's ridiculous combat system, which they did in Star Ocean 5, but by the time they fixed it, they didn't have time to do any work on the rest of it. And that means that it's half-baked. And then everyone was angry. Everyone hated that game. Except for me, but you know. And then you have, obviously, you know, the war between, the great war between Star Ocean 3 and Star Ocean 4. Remember that, guys? Yeah, that was a war and a half. You had the people that were, violently loyal to Star Ocean 3. And then you have the people on the other side that hate Star Ocean 3 but love Star Ocean 4, despite the fact that Star Ocean 4 has one of the most cringeworthy casts of characters. And then Star Ocean 3 fans are like, oh yeah, the cast of characters in 4 is so cringe and annoying, we have better cast of characters. And then you have the Star Ocean 4, and it's like, well yeah, at least our game doesn't play like ass, you know? And at least our game doesn't have a plot twist, which yada 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 yada. And it's just it's so silly. And then you have Star Ocean 2, everyone loves that game. Everyone adores it. And I never understood it. It's why can everyone just agree with this one game and then demonize the rest? And then you had Star Ocean 6. And that game saved everything. That game saved the series. It did. It rescued the series from, it just completely saved everything. I can't begin to express just how much of a big deal that game was. That game brought most people together. Not everyone, unfortunately. There's going to be those people that hated it, obviously, but it brought a lot of people together, and I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that it took from the systems that worked well in 4, and it brought back or at least close enough to the original item creation from 2 and 1, and Blue Sphere, kind of, if you count that, the one that everybody agreed on being good and everybody loves. Yeah, they brought that one back instead of the freaking convoluted mess that was 3's invention system and the limited item creation of 4's. And they made the perfect compromise with it. Star Ocean 6 is what Star Ocean 5 really should have been in retrospect, but because Tri-Ace listened to the fans, which I get it, it's understandable, they want to listen to the fans and hear what they say. And I don't even just blame Tri-Ace, I blame Square Enix, because I feel that Square Enix played a part in the input to Tri-Ace. That's why Star Ocean 5 ended up the way it was. It wasn't because of Tri-Ace, it wasn't because of Square Enix, although you could partially say it's Square Enix, but you know, it was the fans. The fans made that game what it is. Whether you like Star Ocean 5 or not, you have to agree and admit that as fans, you made that happen. You are the reason why that game ended up the way it did. And I will take responsibility for that because I went in there knowing that it would be like that. Even though I wasn't one of these people that was basically just trashing on each of the series without showing love equally. And I think that's the thing. I feel that there's a lot of people that are just so quick to bash Star Ocean games, specific Star Ocean games, but aren't willing to show love to them at all in any way, shape or form. I do think it's important to bash games. I do think it is important, but you've got to show love for them every now and again and respect them and show your appreciation. And Star Ocean 3 is a game that I absolutely do love. I don't know how I can truly express my appreciation for that game, but it did what most games in the series could never do, and it does something truly interesting. And it's a game that, honestly, I can't wait to get back to. I look forward to going back to Star Ocean 3 in the near future. So, you can look forward to me playing some Star Ocean 3 on the channel, because I can't wait to go back to that game and relive that experience, even though it will make me miserable, and I know it will, but I know that that misery is essential. I need to remember everything. I need to go back, relive it, and immerse myself in the misery again. Just simply so that I can truly remember what it was like, but also just simply so that I can show that appreciation again, express that appreciation, and just, experience the moment again. That's one thing I definitely need to do. Because Star Ocean Till the End of Time, it's not all bad. There are good aspects to that game that people, you know, need to bear in mind. But there's a lot of bad. So stop bashing games without loving them, and stop worshipping games without bashing them, people. Take a middle ground. My favourite game of all time is Valhalla 2 Silmeria, and I am always bashing that game. I will bash the fact that the game starts with a fucking NPC literally phasing through a fucking barrel at the beginning of the game. That's how much I bash it. That, and the fact that obviously the mages are imbalanced, which pisses me off, because my favourite character in gaming is one of those characters, and he's stupidly weak. He's one of the worst characters in the game, gameplay-wise, and that annoys me. Among other things, like trapped treasure chests, which also annoy me. There are annoying aspects in that game that I do criticize, but I love it to death. It's my favourite game of all time. Just because I bash it doesn't change that fact. So maybe be more open to other people's criticism. Maybe stop getting upset and overly sensitive when people bash a game you like. And maybe stop overly bashing games and have like a more balanced stance on each game. Because if you overly bash any Star Ocean game and say that it's 100% tried, maybe this series isn't for you. Because I will say, even the worst of Star Ocean games, except maybe the phone game because it's gacha. I mean, the phone game is an exception because of what it is. It's not a real game to me. It's a gacha, and that's the problem. It's predatory, like all phone games are. But that's a different ball game. That's not really Tri-Ace's fault. Obviously, they need to make money somehow, I guess. And obviously, Square Enix gave them that choice. And yeah, they're going to take it because they need it. But obviously, those gacha games are not good. They aren't really games in the same sense. They are essentially designed to make as much money out of people as possible and exploit people. That's what they're designed to do. And I don't agree with that. But none of Tri-Ace's other, like proper full games are like that. Like, the thing about Tri-Ace games is they are all lovable in some way, shape, or form, and I can see the appeal in every single one. I can see that I can just love every single one of them, even though I hate them. Even though I despise them. And that's something that's truly magical. If a game company can make games that consistently lovable and hateable, then that's truly something incredible, and people need to celebrate that. And that's why I love Tri-Ace so much. That's why that company is amazing, and why we need more of their games. And I'm not saying we need to have more Valve Profile or Star Ocean. More of their stuff is really what we need. That's what this industry needs. Even new IPs. I welcome new IPs from Tri-Ace. I don't care what it is. If it exists, I want to give it a go and see if it's any good. As long as it's not on phones. But that's just me. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you all next time.